Why did her hands never tremble? That was the first thing anyone noticed when they watched Taylor at work. Her fingers moved with a precision that was almost unsettling. Every adjustment, every motion around the cold steel of a weapon's scope carried the calm of someone who had been doing this far too long. She treated glass and metal the way an artist treated canvas and paint, deliberate, focused, reverent. The morning light slipped in through the armory window, catching the faint scratches across the scope in her hand. At first glance, it was nothing, a blemish, wear and tear from years in the field. But when the sun struck it just right, when the angle sharpened into perfect alignment, something appeared. A skull, ghostly, resting over crosshairs. It was the kind of marking that didn't belong here, not in a Navy armory, not in any official inventory. And when Commander Jake Rivers saw it, when his eyes fell upon that faint insignia, he froze. He had been in more firefights than he cared to count. He had seen men die, and he had watched men kill with nothing but duty in their eyes. But this was different. His face drained of color, his breath caught just for a second, because he knew what it meant. That skull was a phantom. Not a patch, not a symbol you'd find in history books or after-action reports. It belonged to a unit that officially never existed, a whisper of a team that lived only in classified briefings and rumors passed in the dark corners of war. The Phantom Unit. Rivers hadn't seen that insignia in over a decade, 13 years to be exact. He remembered the day clearly, a locked room, security clearances stacked higher than most generals ever reached, a table of men and women who didn't trade in theories but in shadows. They spoke of a group that did the things even Special Operations Command wouldn't touch. No records, no names, ghosts with rifles. And now that same insignia was here, on a scope, in his armory, in the hands of a quiet contractor who was supposed to be no more than a weapons specialist. Taylor. She didn't flinch when he asked her about it. She didn't blink. Her pale blue eyes met his with a steadiness that told him everything and nothing all at once. Where had it come from? Why was it here? And more pressing, who exactly was she? The maintenance bay buzzed around them with morning routine. Tools clinking, technicians moving, the low hum of voices filling the sterile air. But for Rivers, the room had gone quiet. All he could hear was the pounding of his own heart, the soft scrape of her cloth as she polished the scope, and the silence that followed his question. She looked calm, too calm, the way predators looked before they struck. Her answer was simple, practiced. Sometimes equipment travels in ways that aren't conventional. It was a deflection, not a lie, not the truth, something in between. Rivers had heard that tone before. He'd used it himself when speaking to politicians who weren't clear to know what their soldiers were really doing in the deserts and mountains of the world. It was the tone of someone trained to bury secrets beneath layers of plausible deniability. And it only confirmed his suspicion. Taylor wasn't what she appeared to be. 3 years she had been here, officially just a civilian contractor. Her file was thin, former Army sniper instructor at Fort Benning, some work with defense contractors afterward, nothing remarkable on paper. Yet even SEALs, men who lived on the edge of violence, paused when she passed. Something in the way she moved, something in the way she saw everything without appearing to look at anything at all. Predators knew predators. Rivers tried to press. He lowered his voice, leaning closer so no one else would hear. That mark, I've seen it before. You want to tell me how it ended up on my scope? She held his stare. A faint tightening around her eyes betrayed what her words didn't. She knew exactly what he'd seen, and she knew that he knew. For a moment the mask slipped, just long enough for Rivers to glimpse what lived beneath. Not a contractor, not a quiet specialist, something older, something sharper, something dangerous. Her denial came soft, controlled. Some questions are better left unasked, Commander. But Rivers couldn't let it go. Not this time. Not with lives on the line. His team was deploying soon. Every weapon, every piece of gear mattered. And if this scope carried the shadow of the Phantom unit, it meant the ghosts of that disbanded team weren't as dead as the record claimed. He pressed harder. That insignia represents people who gave everything without ever being recognized. If their work continues, I need to know what it means for my men. Her hands paused on the scope, just for a heartbeat. And in that silence, Rivers saw something crack through her calm, not fear, not guilt, but weight. The weight of someone carrying truths too heavy for daylight. She finally spoke, her words heavy and deliberate. The people you're thinking of are gone. They died defending things that will never be acknowledged. Their sacrifices can't be spoken of, but they must be protected. It sounded final. It sounded like an ending. But Rivers knew endings when he heard them. This wasn't one. This was a door. And Taylor was standing on the threshold. She packed her tools methodically, each movement clean, precise. Her tone softened but carried a warning sharp as a blade. Support comes in many forms, Commander. Sometimes it means knowing when not to look too closely. Rivers had spent his career walking lines of duty and survival, of law and necessity. But this was different. This was stepping across a boundary into something that couldn't be reported, couldn't be logged, couldn't be explained. Yet he felt it, the pull. Because Taylor wasn't just a contractor. That skull on the glass wasn't just a scratch. It was a message. And messages like that didn't appear by accident. Rivers understood then that he stood at the edge of something vast, something hidden, something that would demand more than orders, more than training. It would demand judgment, loyalty, sacrifice. As Taylor moved toward the exit, her equipment packed neatly at her side, Rivers called after her. If there are people still out there doing that kind of work, maybe they need more than silence. Maybe they need allies. She stopped, didn't turn, didn't speak, just stood there in stillness, the kind that carried more weight than words ever could. And then slowly, she glanced back over her shoulder. Her eyes locked on his, calculating, measuring, deciding. Sometimes, she said quietly, the best ally is the one who doesn't ask why. And with that she walked out. Rivers stood there, the buzz of the maintenance bay creeping back into his ears, the sound of clinking tools and murmured voices resuming like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. He looked down at the scope she had cleaned. The skull was faint now, barely visible, hidden by the way light refracted across polished glass, but it was still there, waiting, watching. He realized his world had just shifted. The scope wasn't just a weapons tool anymore. It was a door into shadows, into questions he wasn't supposed to ask, into secrets people had killed to bury and died to protect. Taylor had left him with nothing and everything. Because now he knew. The Phantom unit wasn't finished. And the woman adjusting scope caps in a Navy armory might just be one of them. How much of her past had she buried? That was the question that refused to leave Jake Rivers' mind as he walked away from the maintenance bay. He had seen soldiers lie before. He had seen them mask pain, dodge questions, bury trauma behind steady eyes. But Taylor wasn't just hiding pain. She was hiding a world. He had tried to sleep that night, tried to close his eyes and let exhaustion drag him under. But the image of that skull over crosshairs burned behind his eyelids, the faint mark on the scope, the calm way she handled his questions, the silence between her words that seemed louder than anything she said. The Phantom unit. 13 years ago he had sat in that locked briefing room, the air stale with secrecy. A handful of men and women listened as an intelligence officer spoke about missions that weren't supposed to exist, targets that couldn't be acknowledged, operations that never made it into reports. We have people, the briefer had said, people who walk where we can't, people who fight where we won't. And now here he was, a Navy SEAL commander, a man who thought he had seen the worst the world could offer. realizing that one of those ghosts was standing in his armory, polishing scopes as if she were just another contractor. The weight of it pressed on him, because if she was still here, if the phantom unit wasn't truly dead, what else had been hidden? The next morning, Rivers found himself scanning the maintenance bay the moment he stepped inside. He tried to play it casual, a routine inspection, but his eyes hunted for her. Taylor was there. Workstation 7, always 7. Her tools laid out like instruments on a surgeon's table, a rifle disassembled in perfect order. Her movements were smooth, efficient, almost ritualistic. She didn't look up when he approached, didn't acknowledge him at all, but he knew she had seen him. She always saw. "Morning," Rivers said softly. Her voice was calm. "Commander." Nothing more. He stood there for a beat, waiting, hoping she might give him something, a hint, a signal. Instead, she moved on with her work, slotting metal into metal with the quiet patience of someone who had done it 10,000 times before. Finally, Rivers broke the silence. "You ever miss it?" That made her pause, just for a second. "Miss what?" "You know what I mean." Her pale eyes lifted, meeting his, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something behind them, something unguarded, not long enough to catch, but enough to know it was there. "Missing doesn't change anything," she said, her voice steady again. "It doesn't bring anyone back." Rivers felt the sting of those words, because he knew what it meant to lose men, to stand over flag-draped coffins, to hand folded flags to families who never asked for the burden of sacrifice. Missing didn't change anything, but it lingered. It ate at you. He leaned in closer. "Taylor, if the phantom unit really is gone, why are you here?" Her jaw tightened. She returned to the rifle, locking the bolt into place with a solid click. Because some things don't disappear just because someone says they should. It wasn't an answer, and yet it was. Rivers studied her every detail, the scars across her knuckles, the calm in her breath, the way her body seemed to exist in two states at once, still, yet ready to move in an instant. She wasn't just a contractor. She wasn't just someone who happened to be here. And he realized something. She was assessing him too, measuring whether he could be trusted. "Look," he said carefully, lowering his voice so no one else could hear. "I'm deploying my men in weeks. If there's something I need to know, something that could get them killed if I don't, I need you to tell me." Taylor's hand stilled. Slowly, she set the rifle down and looked at him fully, no more half-glances. "You think knowing makes you safer?" she asked. Rivers didn't answer. "Knowing doesn't make you safer," she continued. "It just makes you responsible." Her words landed like a stone in his chest, because she was right. Knowledge carried weight. Once you knew, you couldn't unknow, and the burden of action came with it. Taylor reached for a cloth, began wiping down the rifle piece by piece. Her voice softened, but her words cut sharp. "You want answers, Commander, but answers come with debts, debts you might not be willing to pay." Rivers let the silence stretch. She wasn't threatening him. She was warning him that the moment he stepped through that door, there was no turning back. And yet, something inside him already knew he was past that point. Because he had seen the skull. And ghosts don't appear for no reason. That night, Rivers sat alone in his quarters, the glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. He opened his laptop, pulling up classified databases only he had clearance to access. He searched, cross-referenced, dug for scraps of information about the phantom unit. Most of it was gone, redacted, erased, but fragments remained, reports stripped of names, operations marked only by dates and coordinates, places where missions had succeeded without explanation or where enemies had simply vanished. One line stuck out. 2011, unit disbanded, personnel reassigned or separated. Official words, cold and clean, but Rivers knew better. Units like that didn't just evaporate. They either burned out or went deeper underground. He closed the laptop, staring into the silence, and he knew if he wanted the truth, it wouldn't be in a database. It would be in her. The next day he found her again. Same bay, same station, same ritual of weaponry and silence. "Taylor," he said quietly, stepping closer. She didn't look up. "I'm not here to expose anything. I'm not here to compromise you, but my men are walking into Syria. And if there's anything I need to know, anything that could keep them alive, I need you to trust me enough to say it." Her hand slowed, stopped. She turned her head just slightly, her eyes cutting into him like glass. "Trust has to be earned, Commander," she said. He swallowed. "Then tell me how." For the first time, something shifted in her face. The faintest trace of a smile, not warmth, but recognition. "Maybe," she said softly, "you already started." And then, just as before, she packed her tools, sealed the scope, and walked away, leaving Rivers with nothing but more questions, but also the faintest glimmer of something else. Hope, because ghosts don't smile. But maybe Taylor just had. What made her choose silence? That question haunted Jake Rivers more than any classified file he had ever read. Silence could protect, silence could destroy, and Taylor wore hers like armor. 2 weeks passed. His team trained. They drilled under the heat of sand sun, rehearsing deployments, polishing movements until they blurred into instinct. But Rivers' mind wasn't in the training lanes or on the shooting range. It kept drifting back to her, to the skull on the glass, to the way her eyes measured him, testing not his strength but his intent. She hadn't given him answers, not yet, but she had given him something else. The knowledge that his questions weren't unwelcome, just dangerous. Rivers had lived his career by rules. Rules about command, about loyalty, about the chain of trust that bound men together in battle. But Taylor represented something beyond rules. A shadow world where silence wasn't weakness, but survival. And he was standing closer to it with every passing day. He found himself walking the long halls of the base at night, restless, watching his men sleep in their bunks. Young faces, some barely old enough to drink, entrusted to him. They trusted the system. They trusted him. But could he still trust the system? Taylor's words echoed in his memory. "Knowing doesn't make you safer. It just makes you responsible." And responsibility weighed heavier than any rucksack. The opportunity came unexpectedly. A Tuesday morning, Rivers had stepped into the bay again, drawn there by something he didn't fully understand. Taylor was bent over a precision scope, her braid pulled back, sleeves rolled tight to her forearms. She looked up this time, as if she'd been waiting. "You're persistent," she said. "You don't leave me much choice." Her lips curved almost into a smile. "Most people learn faster." "I'm not most people." She studied him, long, silent, and then she said something he hadn't expected. "Walk with me." The words were quiet, but they carried weight. She finished packing her tools, slung her case over her shoulder, and walked out. Rivers followed. Through the bay, past the humming machines, out into the sharp daylight. She didn't speak until they were clear of watchful eyes, beyond the reach of security cameras, down the long stretch of asphalt that led toward the docks. The air was heavy with salt and engine fumes. The sea glittered in the distance, calm, deceptive. Taylor stopped, turned. "Do you know what it means to disappear, Commander?" Rivers frowned. "Disappear?" Her eyes locked on his. Not on paper, not in theory, in truth, to have every record erased, every photograph scrubbed, to have your name mean nothing, even to the people who once saluted it. He didn't answer. "That's what happened to them," she said softly. "The ones who wore that insignia, they didn't just die, they were erased, gone from history, as if they never lived." Her voice cracked barely, enough for him to hear it. Rivers felt his throat tighten. "And you?" Taylor's gaze drifted past him toward the water. For a moment her silence was louder than any answer. Then she spoke. Some ghosts don't vanish. Some keep working. Because the world doesn't stop needing them even after the system decides it's done. It wasn't an admission. It wasn't denial. It was both. Rivers stepped closer, his voice low, urgent. If you're still one of them, if you're still doing that kind of work, then you know things I don't. And if you know things I don't, my men's lives are at stake. I can't ignore that, Taylor. She turned back to him, and for the first time he saw it, the grief behind her calm, the weariness of someone who had carried too much for too long. You think you want the truth, she whispered, but the truth isn't clean, it stains. Once you touch it, it never washes off. He let the words hang. The wind tugged at their uniforms. Somewhere in the distance, gulls cried over the harbor. Finally, he asked, "Then why tell me anything at all?" Her eyes softened just slightly. "Because you remind me of someone," she said. "Someone who believed in protecting people, even when the rules didn't." It hit him harder than he expected, because that was who he wanted to be, who he tried to be. And maybe she saw that. They stood there in silence, the kind that says more than words. Then Taylor reached into her pocket. She pulled out something small, metallic, a casing, brass, worn smooth at the edges. She placed it in his hand. "Keep it," she said. Rivers turned it over. A bullet casing, etched with the same faint skull he'd seen on the scope. "What is this?" "A reminder," she said, "that nothing ever really disappears." And with that she walked away. Rivers stayed there long after she was gone, the casing heavy in his palm. He knew now, whatever she was, whoever she was, this was only the beginning. That night sleep didn't come, not because of fear, but because of something else. Anticipation. He felt it deep in his bones. Taylor hadn't just given him a trinket, she'd given him an invitation. Into shadows. Into secrets. Into a world where silence spoke louder than medals. And Jake Rivers knew, whether he was ready or not, he was already part of it. Why didn't she just walk away? Taylor could have. She had the skill, the instinct, the discipline. She could have cut him out with silence and vanished into the system that had erased her once already. But instead she lingered, left him with traces, a word here, a glance there, a bullet casing in his palm. Ghosts weren't supposed to leave evidence, yet she had. And Jake Rivers couldn't let it go. Every day his team drew closer to deployment. Syria was waiting with its tangled web of militias and foreign powers, a chessboard where every wrong move meant body bags. He had the responsibility, the weight of keeping his men alive. But now, for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't expected: doubt. Because if Taylor was connected to the Phantom unit, if she was one of them or still working in their shadow, then she had knowledge, intelligence, resources, secrets his command didn't, and he had to decide, follow the rules or follow the ghosts. The choice came one night in the mess hall. The place was almost empty, the smell of burnt coffee clinging to the air. Rivers sat alone at the far table, staring at the casing she'd given him, turning it over and over between his fingers. And then she walked in, quiet, almost invisible, yet he felt her before he saw her. She slid into the seat across from him, her tray untouched. "You still have it," she said softly, her eyes flicking to the casing in his hand. He set it down between them. "You gave it to me. That doesn't mean you should keep it." "Then why give it at all?" She didn't answer, not right away. She studied him, reading more than he wanted her to. Finally, she said, "Because you need to understand what you're asking for." Rivers leaned in, voice low. "Then explain it." Her silence stretched. He could hear the hum of the lights above, the faint scrape of a chair somewhere across the hall. And then she spoke, each word heavy. "The Phantom unit didn't die in 2011. Pieces of it did, people did, but some of us kept going, quietly, unofficially, because the threats didn't stop. They only grew." Rivers' pulse quickened. She had said it. Finally, she had broken her silence. Taylor's eyes locked on his. What you need to understand is that we answer to no one, no command, no government, no politician. The only loyalty left is to the mission, to stopping threats before they ever reach your doorstep. Rivers swallowed hard, and you're still part of it. Her expression didn't change, but her silence was enough. He exhaled, leaning back. The truth hung between them, dangerous and undeniable. "You realize what you're telling me," he said. "I'm not telling you anything," she replied evenly. "I'm letting you see enough to decide if you want to know more." Rivers stared at her, weighing everything, his career, his oath, his men's lives. And in that moment he understood something simple and terrifying. If he chose to walk away, she'd vanish. He'd never see her again. The door would close. But if he chose to step forward, there would be no turning back. He picked up the casing again, rolling it between his fingers. "My team is going into Syria," he said finally. "The intel is thin. The rules are than ever. I'm walking blind into a minefield. If there's anything you or your people know that could help, I need it." Taylor's gaze sharpened. She studied him the way a sniper studies a target, calculating angles, measuring risk. And then quietly, "Support comes in many forms, Commander. Sometimes the most valuable isn't what you know. It's who you know when things start to fall apart." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means you'll hear from us when the time is right." Rivers shook his head. "That's not enough, my men." Her voice cut through him, firm, final. "Your men will be safer because of us. That's all you need to know." He stopped. The conviction in her voice was unshakable, and for a moment he saw it, the weight she carried, the ghost she still walked with. Taylor stood, picking up her tray. "You wanted the truth, now you have enough of it." As she turned to leave, Rivers called after her. "Why me?" She paused. "Why tell me it all?" She looked back, her expression unreadable. "Because," she said softly, "some burdens aren't meant to be carried alone." And then she walked away, disappearing into the dim corridors of the base, leaving him with more than he bargained for. Rivers sat there long after she was gone, the casing in his hand, his mind racing. He knew now. He wasn't just leading his men into Syria. He was stepping into something far bigger. The Phantom unit wasn't gone. It was waiting. And Taylor had just opened the door. What price would he pay for the truth? That was the question burning in Jake Rivers' mind as his team prepared for deployment. The days ticked down, the checklists piled up, ammunition counted, comms checked, flight manifests signed, all routine, all official. But nothing felt routine anymore, not since Taylor had spoken those words. The Phantom unit didn't die. It wasn't a rumor now, it wasn't a whisper, it was a fact, and with that fact came a choice. He tried to bury it. He tried to focus on his men. But the moment he closed his eyes, he saw her, calm, unshakable, her voice steady as she warned him. "The truth doesn't make you safer. It makes you responsible." And then, the night before Wheels Up, she came to him. It was late, past midnight. The base was quiet, the hallways dim. Rivers was in his quarters, boots off, uniform shirt draped across the chair. A knock came at the door, sharp, deliberate. When he opened it, Taylor stood there. No words, no explanations, just a small black case in her hand. "May I come in?" He stepped aside. She entered like a shadow, silent but steady. The case clicked open on his desk. Inside, a device. Military-grade comms gear but modified, sleeker, darker, wires cut and replaced, antenna trimmed to something far more advanced. "What is this?" he asked. Her eyes lifted to his. "A lifeline." He frowned. "To who?" "To the people who don't exist. To the ones who will be in Syria before you, watching where you can't, hearing what you won't. If you need them, if they choose to trust you, this is how." Rivers stared at it, the weight of it settling like stone in his chest. Taking it meant stepping fully into her world. A world without oversight, a world of shadows. "Why me?" he whispered. "Because you're already carrying more than you should," she said softly. "And because whether you admit it or not, you've already crossed the line." Silence filled the room. Rivers reached out, fingers brushing the cold metal of the device. "This could cost me my career," he said. Taylor's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "It could save your men." And that was it. That was all it took. Because careers end, but death doesn't. Rivers closed the case and slid it toward himself. "Tell me how it works." Her instructions were precise. Frequencies, encryption keys, authentication codes, layers of security buried in ordinary chatter. To anyone listening, transmissions would sound routine, checkpoints, weather updates. But to those with the right keys, they would mean something else entirely. By the time she was done, Rivers knew he was holding more than equipment. He was holding a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Taylor stood to leave. At the door she paused, glancing back at him. "Trust has to be earned," she said quietly. "But tonight I gave you mine." Then she was gone. Rivers sat in the silence of his quarters, staring at the device. His men's lives flashed through his mind. Their faces, their laughter, their trust in him. And he knew he wasn't just a SEAL commander anymore. He was now something else. A bridge. The deployment came fast. The flight to Syria was long, silent, filled with the restless energy of men heading into danger. When they landed at the forward operating base, the air was thick with dust and tension. Within hours, Rivers tested the device. Not with a call, not with a message, just with silence. He powered it on, tuned the frequency, and waited. Nothing. For 3 days, nothing. His men patrolled, gathered intel, made maps out of fragments. The official channels dripped information that was already stale by the time it arrived. And then, on the 4th night, it came. A burst of static, a click, a voice low and calm, unfamiliar. "Convoy Highway West, 48 hours, 6 vehicles, 2 armed escorts. You'll know them by the paint." Rivers froze, listening. The voice continued, coded but clear. "Timing exact, confirm receipt." His throat was dry. He leaned toward the mic. "Received." Static, then silence. He sat there in the dark, the glow of the device casting long shadows across the tent walls. His heart pounded, because what he just heard wasn't from official channels. It wasn't filtered through analysts or reports. It was raw, direct, a whisper from the ghosts. And now he had to decide. Act on it or ignore it. If it was real, they had a chance to strike hard, disrupt the flow of weapons into enemy hands. If it was false, he'd be leading his men into a trap. Either way, the responsibility was his. He looked around the tent, at the photos pinned to his board, the map spread across the table, the sleeping bags where his men rested. And he realized the truth. Taylor was right. Knowing didn't make him safer. It just made him responsible. He reached for the map, his mind already turning, planning, adjusting, preparing. Because one thing was certain. The Phantom unit was with him now. And nothing about this deployment would ever be the same. What if it was a trap? That thought never left Jake Rivers' mind as he studied the map by the dim glow of the tent light. 6 vehicles, 2 escorts, 48 hours. The Phantom voice had been calm, certain, but certainty didn't guarantee truth. He had no way of knowing who that voice belonged to. No rank. No face. Just a whisper in the dark from a unit that didn't exist. And yet, his gut told him it was real. He spread the map wider, tracing the convoy's route with his finger. Highway West. A stretch of broken asphalt that ran through barren desert, framed by low ridges on either side. If the intel was good, it was perfect for an ambush. If the intel was bad, it was perfect for his men to die. He waited again. Rules, orders, loyalty. And then he thought of Taylor, the steadiness in her eyes, the weight in her voice when she said some things don't disappear. Ghosts didn't leave false trails. He made the call. By dawn, his men were moving. Armored vehicles rolled across dust-choked roads, engines growling low. The team rode in silence, their faces set, weapons cradled tight. They didn't know the source of the intel. Rivers hadn't told them. He couldn't. All they knew was their commander had a plan. They reached the 2 hours before the convoy was expected. The sun was still low, the air cool. They dug in, positioning rifles and scopes along the rocks. Silence wrapped around them, broken only by the whisper of radios. Minutes crawled into hours. Doubt gnawed at Rivers. Had he led them into nothing? Worse, into danger they couldn't see. Every shadow on the horizon made his pulse tighten. And then they appeared. 6 trucks, dust rising in their wake. 2 armed technicals bracketing the formation, mounted guns swiveling, exactly as described. Rivers' chest tightened. The phantom intel was real. He raised his hand, gave the signal. His men tensed, fingers poised on triggers, eyes fixed through scopes. "Wait," Rivers whispered into comms. "Wait." The convoy drew closer. He could see faces now, drivers, escorts, could almost feel the rumble of engines through the ground. And then his hand dropped. They exploded in gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit the rocks. Bullets shredded tires, ripped through windshields. Chaos erupted below as the convoy screeched to a halt, men spilling from vehicles, scrambling for cover. Rivers barked orders, voice steady over the storm. His men moved like clockwork, shifting positions, cutting down resistance. One by one the enemy fell. Trucks smoked, engines burned. Within minutes it was over. Silence settled. The only sound was the crackle of flames licking metal. Rivers scanned the wreckage, breath heavy. Weapons crates spilled from the backs of the trucks, marked with stenciled codes. Iranian origin, bound for Hezbollah hands. They had stopped it, exactly as promised. His men cheered quietly, relief flooding their faces. A clean win, minimal casualties, textbook. But Rivers felt none of it. Because victory wasn't what settled in his chest, it was weight. He had acted on intel from ghosts. He had risked everything on the word of people who didn't exist, and it had worked. But what if next time it did? Back at the forward operating base, the questions came fast. His commanding officer wanted to know how he'd known, why he'd deployed so precisely, how he'd predicted the convoy's route. Rivers gave answers that were technically true but hollow. Pattern analysis, local chatter, good guesswork. He watched his commander's eyes. Suspicion flickered, but no more. The lie sat heavy in his throat. Later that night, as he sat alone in his tent, the device crackled again. The same voice, calm and measured. "Good work, the crates won't reach Beirut now. You saved lives." Rivers clenched his fists. "Who are you?" Static, then silence. No answer, no explanation, just the reminder that he wasn't alone and that his choices now tied him to them. He sat back, the desert wind rattling the canvas walls around him. His men slept a few feet away, exhausted but alive, and Rivers knew the truth. He had crossed the line. He had stepped fully into Taylor's world. And there was no going back. How many lies could he carry before one of them killed him? That thought haunted Jake Rivers as the days bled into nights in Syria. His men trusted him. His command expected reports. And in between, the ghosts whispered. Every transmission came the same way, short, precise, undeniable. Convoys, hidden caches, intel so sharp it cut through the fog of war like a blade. Rivers acted on it, and each time his men came home alive. Each time the mission succeeded. And each time he lied a little more. His reports to command were careful, crafted with surgical precision. He cited routine surveillance, local informants, pattern analysis, always plausible, always just enough to explain results that would otherwise seem impossible. But with every half-truth, the gap widened between who he was and who he was becoming. One night his commanding officer confronted him. The tent was dim, the lantern casting harsh shadows across the walls. "You've had too many wins, Jake," the colonel said flatly. "Too clean, too perfect. Where are you really getting this intel?" Rivers kept his face calm, his voice steady. "Sir, I trust my men. We work patterns harder than most, that's all." The colonel studied him for a long, uncomfortable silence. "Just remember," he said finally, "miracles get noticed, and when people notice, they start asking questions you don't want to answer." Then he left. Rivers sat in the silence, his stomach heavy. The warning was clear. If command dug too deep, it wouldn't just be his career on the line. It would be Taylor's. It would be the Ghost's. And yet the very next night, the device came alive again. This time the voice wasn't calm. It was urgent. "Hostile cell. Planning strike against American contractors in Aleppo. 48 hours. Small arms, explosives. If you move now, you stop it." Rivers froze. Contractors, civilians, not soldiers who'd signed up to fight, families, fathers, mothers, people who came to build, not to die. His orders said nothing about Aleppo, nothing about defending civilian contractors. Officially, they weren't his mission. But unofficially, how could he ignore it? He wrestled with it for hours, on one hand disobeying orders, risking exposure, on the other letting innocents die. And then he remembered Taylor's words. Some burdens aren't meant to be carried alone. He keyed the mic, "Confirm location." Coordinates came back instantly, precise, cold. By dawn, his team was on the move. They raided a compound on the city's edge, catching the cell mid-preparation. Explosives wired, weapons stacked. The fight was brutal, close quarters, the kind where every decision meant survival or death. But they stopped it. The cell was neutralized, dozens of lives spared. And once again, Rivers filed a report full of omissions. That night his men celebrated quietly, relief in their eyes. But Rivers sat alone, staring at the comms device. He realized it wasn't just his men who depended on the Phantom unit now. Civilians did too. And the cost of that dependence was growing. A week later, the whispers came with a new twist. Not just intel, a request. "Your unit has access to supply drops near the border. We need certain equipment diverted, quietly, for operations that can't be traced." Rivers froze at the words. This was different. This wasn't just receiving. This was giving, helping the Ghost stay alive. And if he agreed, he'd be complicit, not just a beneficiary, a partner. He sat with it for hours, the desert night pressing in. The weight of the decision felt heavier than combat ever had. And then, without warning, his tent flap rustled. Taylor stood there. He hadn't seen her since San. But now, in Syria, in the middle of his deployment, she was here. Her eyes found his in the dim light. Calm, steady, but beneath that calm, something else. "Jake," she said quietly, "we need to talk." And Rivers knew. The line he thought he'd already crossed was only the beginning. How far could you walk into shadows before you stopped seeing the light? That was the question Jake Rivers carried with him as he stared at Taylor across the small Syrian outpost. She looked unchanged, calm, steady, precise, but he knew better now. Beneath her silence lived a world of ghosts. "Why are you here?" he asked. Taylor's voice was low. "Because the line between your world and mine is thinner than you think, and you've already stepped across it." He wanted to deny it, wanted to say he was still a commander, still bound by orders, still accountable to a flag and a chain of command. But deep inside, he knew she was right. Every lie he'd written in a report, every mission run on whispers, every choice made in secret, he was already part of her world. "You saved civilians in Aleppo," she continued. "You think that was an accident? That intel didn't fall from the sky. We gave it to you because we wanted to see what kind of man you were, and now we know." River's jaw tightened. "And what am I?" Her eyes didn't flinch. "A man who will break rules to save lives. That's the only kind of ally worth having." The words struck deep, because wasn't that what he had always been? Wasn't that the heart of every impossible choice he'd made in war to protect those who couldn't protect themselves? But Taylor wasn't finished. "We need you," she said. "Not just your team. You. Because there are places even the strongest soldier can't go without someone inside official channels keeping the door open." Rivers felt the weight of it. She wasn't asking for favors. She was asking for complicity, a permanent bridge between two worlds, the sanctioned and the shadowed. He thought of his men, of the families waiting for them back home, of the lives already saved by phantom whispers, and he thought of the lies piling higher, heavier, harder to carry. "What happens," he asked, "when command finds out?" Taylor's voice softened. "They won't, not unless you tell them, and even if they did, by then the work will already be done." Silence stretched between them. The desert wind hissed through the cracks in the tent, rattling maps pinned to the wall. Finally, Rivers spoke. "And what about you? How long can you keep living like this?" For the first time her mask cracked, just slightly, enough to see the weight in her eyes. "Long enough," she whispered, "until someone else carries it." The words hung heavy. That night the device crackled again. New intel, another operation, another chance to save lives. Rivers listened, wrote it down, and felt the familiar weight press into his chest. He would act, he would protect, he would lead, but he would also lie. Because that was the price of walking with ghosts. Weeks later, as the deployment neared its end, Rivers stood on the airfield, watching his men board the plane home. Their laughter carried across the tarmac, tired but alive. They didn't know how close they had come to dying. They didn't know the shadows that had guarded them. And maybe that was the point. Taylor appeared beside him, silent as always. She didn't speak, and neither did he. They just watched the men climb the ramp. Finally, she said, "Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts." Rivers turned to her, but she was already walking away, swallowed by the dust and the noise of engines. He knew he might never see her again, or maybe he would, when the world needed shadows more than sunlight. As the plane lifted into the sky, Rivers felt the casing in his pocket. The skull etched in brass pressed against his palm like a reminder. The Phantom unit was gone, and yet it was. It lived in people like Taylor. And now it lived in him. He breathed deep, the weight of command heavier than ever. He didn't know what history would say about him if it said anything at all, but he knew this. Sometimes the most important battles aren't written in reports. Sometimes the greatest loyalty is silent. And sometimes the truest service is the kind no one ever knows existed.